Welcome back to 1834. Le Bourdonnais is winning 4 games to 3 and it's the first to win 5 that will take this 6th match. So Le Bourdonnais needs just 1 whilst McDonnell needs 2. Today's guest commentator is King Ghezo, king of the Dahomey in Africa since 1818. Le Bourdonnais once more has the white pieces. McDonnell has only had them twice in the last 8 games. There may be a very good reason for that, but I will explain in a later video. Le Bourdonnais opens with e4. We have e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, bishop to c5, and once more Le Bourdonnais plays b4, the Evans gambit. And everybody knows that a gentleman must accept a gambit, and of course McDonnell is a gentleman, so he accepts. We have c3 here, chasing the bishop back to a5, and Le Bourdonnais takes the opportunity to castle. d6, letting the light square bishop out, and d4 into the centre, leading to a pawn exchange. McDonnell plays his bishop back to b6, as he usually does, and lines up against the king, and here Le Bourdonnais very sneakily plays knight to c3 instead of his usual bishop to b2. Now this means that when McDonnell plays his usual knight to f6, the bishop is available, because it's not on b2, to come out and pin the knight against the queen. Le Bourdonnais could also have advanced his e5 pawn here, and got a lot of advantage, just as McDonnell did in the previous game, which McDonnell won after only 20 moves. Here, McDonnell plays h6, trying to chase away the bishop, but instead it captures and lures the queen out onto f6 when it recaptures. We have e5 now from Le Bourdonnais, and the pawn captures. The knight captures, and we have a knight exchange here on e5, with the queen ending up being attacked here. McDonnell could bring the queen forward to f4 and keep up the pressure on the pawn, but instead he goes for h4. Now, King Ghezo is very upset with the British because they abolished slavery in the empire last year in 1833, so he wants to help out the Frenchman, Le Bourdonnais. He says, bring the queen to a4 with check, and then no matter what McDonnell does to block it, be it with the pawn or with the bishop, you're going to sacrifice your white bishop with check and reveal the attack upon the black queen. So after the king captures, the black queen is lost. Or alternatively, if he doesn't block with the pawn or the bishop, he's going to move across to f8 and lose his castling powers and lock his rook in, so you will have a lot of advantage here. But Le Bourdonnais doesn't listen to the king, so what does he do? He plays QE2, the Queen Elizabeth move, which is a bit of a blunder, to be honest. Sorry, Your Majesty. McDonnell takes the opportunity to castle. Le Bourdonnais is very wary of this bishop bearing down upon his king, so he moves the king aside to h1, and McDonnell completes his development, bishop to g4, threatening the white queen. Although King Ghezo says this is not so good because it allows queen to e4, which would be very awkward for McDonnell pinning the bishop. But Le Bourdonnais doesn't go for this move, instead he plays f3 to chase away the bishop directly. And the bishop should probably come back to f5 here because it'll have a lot of range across all of these white squares, but McDonnell instead retreats to h5, which is not so good because you'll see shortly that this sort of traps the bishop. Meanwhile, Le Bourdonnais doubles up into the center with his rook, and McDonnell brings his kingside rook across to x-ray the queen. Now we have g4 from Le Bourdonnais chasing the bishop, and it goes back, and once more Le Bourdonnais continues pushing a pawn to f4, trying to lock in this bishop. We have c6 from McDonnell, trying to do something with his pawns, and now, as expected, f5, and the bishop has to go all the way back to h7, and as you can see, it's now very limited in its scope. King Ghezo suggests that sacrificing the bishop is an option, capturing the f-pawn, and after the black king captures the bishop, you can start pushing your pawns forward and pressurizing the king this way. But Le Bourdonnais doesn't go for this idea. Instead, he brings his rook up to the 7th rank, also a very powerful move. But McDonnell keeps calm and offers a rook exchange, which Le Bourdonnais accepts, with the queen recapturing the white rook. And now Le Bourdonnais starts pushing forward his pawns. We have captures from the f-pawn, and the white bishop captures the black pawn here with check. King Ghezo suggests selling the captives back to the British, but McDonnell is a man of high moral standing, and he instead moves the king out of the way to h8. We have rook to d1 now, getting on the open file, and McDonnell plays his rook across to f8. Ghezo says that bringing the knight to e4 closer to the action would be a good idea, but Le Bourdonnais instead brings his second rook up to the 7th rank to threaten the queen. So McDonnell gets his queen out of there to c5, but really it's a veiled checkmate threat on g1, so Le Bourdonnais has to defend this, and he brings his queen back to e1. Now, McDonnell should probably try to get his horrible bishop unstuck here, perhaps bring it back to the back rank and go for a bishop exchange, but instead he moves his other bishop to a5. What's he doing? Well, he's obviously performing a double attack upon the knight whilst also x-raying the white queen. So what does Le Bourdonnais do? He decides to offer a queen exchange and brings the knight to e4, obviously attacking the black queen whilst revealing the attack upon the white queen. McDonnell says, I am happy to accept your terms, but first I'm taking a pawn out, and grabs the f5 pawn, so that's very nice. The white pawn captures the queen and the black bishop captures the white queen. So after all that, what's the situation with material? Well, McDonnell is now up 2 pawns. He has 5 to Le Bourdonnais' 3, and McDonnell also has a bishop pair to Le Bourdonnais' bishop and knight. So it's looking very good for McDonnell. Let's see what happens next. Le Bourdonnais continues with knight to d6, and now he's performing a double attack upon the b pawn, and there's nothing that McDonnell can do to save it. It looks like he's going to have to give 1 pawn back. In the meantime, he tries to get his bishop unstuck, bishop to g8, and the white rook captures the black pawn. King Ghezo approves. He says that the slave trade is the ruling principle of his people, it is the source and glory of their wealth. And the game continues. The rook is threatening the a pawn, so McDonnell brings the bishop to f2 to defend it, and we have knight to f7 with check. McDonnell takes the opportunity to get rid of the bishop. The white bishop recaptures the bishop, and McDonnell brings the dark square bishop all the way back to b6 to try to limit the scope of the white rook. It's now starting to look a lot like an endgame, so Le Bourdonnais activates his king, as does McDonnell, and the king keeps coming forwards. But McDonnell's is now stuck, so he pushes a pawn to let the king come further up the board. Le Bourdonnais doesn't want to capture the pawn here because he'll just give up his own one with check. He's already 1 pawn down, so he doesn't want to lose any more material. So instead, he brings the bishop down for a check, which also defends the pawn, but the king just comes forward. Le Bourdonnais now wants to get his rook onto a more active square, so he comes forward to the open central files, and McDonnell does likewise, rook to d8. We have rook to e6 now, threatening some revealed checks on the king, but the king just keeps coming forward to g5. So the rook goes back again and threatens the undefended pawn, but this bishop comes forward to defend it, and the rook comes down now to threaten the bishop, but it just comes forward to f6 to consolidate, not Le Bourdonnais, to consolidate McDonnell's position. Here King Ghezo has another suggestion. He says push h4 with check and send the king back to h6 because he can't come any further forward due to the rook. But Le Bourdonnais instead decides to threaten the undefended c-pawn, which actually gives McDonnell an opportunity to infiltrate the position here with check, but he doesn't take it, he instead defends the pawn. And now Le Bourdonnais pushes h4 and sends the king scurrying back to h6. Le Bourdonnais pushes his wing pawn, and McDonnell takes the chance to advance his dangerous passed pawn forward by 1 square to c5. Le Bourdonnais needs to keep an eye on this, it could become very dangerous. For now, he brings the bishop back to f7 and adds a defender to the rook should anything threaten it, and McDonnell brings his bishop to d4. Le Bourdonnais takes the opportunity to advance his king 1 more square, and McDonnell gets his rook on the open b file. Rook to c2 from Le Bourdonnais, but this allows the rook to infiltrate. He's threatening the undefended pawn whilst also giving an x-ray on the king. King Ghezo says that a wise move would be to break the x-ray by moving the king down to f3, but instead Le Bourdonnais brings the rook back to c4. He's trying to defend the pawn whilst also being defended himself by the bishop, but this allows McDonnell to play bishop to f2, attacking this undefended pawn whilst effectively pinning this rook. Le Bourdonnais doesn't really want to capture here because after the pawn captures, these 2 pawns are going to be extremely strong on the wing. So he doesn't go for this capture. He brings the king up to e5 and breaks the pin instead. Now from here, the sequence rook captures rook, bishop captures pawn is very good for McDonnell because now the rooks are off the board and he's 4 pawns up to Le Bourdonnais' 2. But he decides not to go for this sequence. Instead, he decides to capture the pawn first, which allows Le Bourdonnais to retain his rook. This pawn is still going to fall, however, so it's still good for McDonnell. In the meantime, he brings his bishop back to f6 to give a check and allow the pawn scope for advancing. Le Bourdonnais brings his king to e6 because it is check, and McDonnell captures the wing pawn. Rook to c8 from Le Bourdonnais, perhaps trying to get in behind the king or behind the pawn, but McDonnell just advances h4. We have bishop to e8, threatening the rook, and the rook comes across to give a check on the king, whilst also attacking the bishop. But the king just advances, defends the bishop, and the black king advances and threatens the pawn. So Le Bourdonnais defends it with his rook. Rook to e2 from McDonnell, and Le Bourdonnais says, let's just have a pawn exchange. I'll get this one while you can have this one. But McDonnell says nope and advances to a5. Now, Le Bourdonnais should really think about bringing his rook back to the back rank, c1, and having full range to try to defend the two wing pawns, but instead he wants to defend his own pawn with the bishop to d7, and McDonnell advances. Le Bourdonnais is probably thinking that rook to e7 is looking quite nasty, so he blocks with the bishop, but the wing pawn comes to h2 now, one square away from queening, so the white rook is forced to come to the back rank to try to defend it. But now McDonnell advances the king. What does Le Bourdonnais do? Well, he tries to maneuver his bishop up to c8 to come around on the long diagonal to offer more defense, but the king keeps coming, so Le Bourdonnais tries to chase it. But now the pawn on the other wing is advancing a4. Bishop to b7 as expected on the long diagonal, and now rook to e3 from McDonnell. Rook to c2 now, getting off the back rank, which he's able to do because the bishop's still guarding the corner square, but McDonnell keeps coming, a3, and we have rook to g2 with check, defended by the bishop, but McDonnell simply steps aside. Rook back to d2, desperately trying to guard everything. Well, there's not really much he can do from now on. Bishop to b2, just wedging himself into the position. King to h5, desperately trying to get back to help the defense, but a2 now from McDonnell, one square away from castling on either side of the board. Le Bourdonnais pushes f6, but it's rather a forlorn hope. King Ghezo is desperately unhappy about the imminent end of his power and makes an appeal to cultural sensitivity. He says that in his land, Dahomey, the mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery. But McDonnell is British, and he's quite determined to end it once and for all. He plays G captures f6, and Le Bourdonnais resigned the game. That's right, McDonnell has actually managed to do it. He's come back from losing 4-2 to level the match at 4 games each. The next game will be the decider, so join me again next time to find out who wins. I'll see you then.